Hi, everyone. My name is Matteo Tamburini. I'm the board president of the Whatcom Peace Justice Center. What I'm doing here is recording the remarks that I gave at our community forum on the crisis in Ukraine. I'm going to start sharing the slides that I shared. The purpose of this brief recording is to give us a sense of the backdrop of US militarism in this current moment. And I think it's worth reiterating that the organization that I represent is called the Whatcom Peace and Justice Center. Our concern is now, and always has been, our own government's foreign policy. You might as well be warned before I proceed. So, it is customary to begin any conversation these days with an acknowledgement of the place where we all are is the traditional homeland of indigenous people and has been that way since time immemorial. And now those lands are part of the United States of America. If we begin with that, that fact tells you most of what you need to know about our government's foreign policy if you really pause to reflect about what that means, that the place where we are now is the United States of America. You might as well keep that in the background of your mind as I proceed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some relevant history, given that so much of it seems to be lacking in our general conversation, and then I'm going to give some background about NATO. The Whatcom Peace and Justice Center, however, it's best to start by saying that we condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we also expose the expansion of NATO. We support diplomacy, not escalation. Our sympathies are now and have been with the Russians who are protesting against the war and with the Ukrainian children who we saw sheltering in the subway in Kiev. However, our belief, our stance is that we are citizens of the United States and we need to focus our time and energy on what we can have an impact on, and that is our own government and the institutions that we are a part of. The American Friends Service Committee has a petition advocating these same points. Okay, let's talk about some relevant history. Growing up, all of the movies, all the stories I heard about World War II were about soldiers from the United States coming to save Europe from the horrors of Nazi occupation. I did not hear any stories about the role that the Soviet Union played in liberating Europe from the Nazis. 60 million Russian people died during the course of World War II, as compared with 420,000 US soldiers. Certainly, this country played a tremendous price in blood for the liberation of Europe, but it is dwarfed by the loss of life that Russia endured. And what you see here on the screen is a map that I have that illustrates the extent of the German invasion of the Soviet Union as of 1941. And I've highlighted, maybe you can see here, where Kiev, the capital of modern-day Ukraine, is, and where Moscow is. The United States never faced anything remotely like this during the course of its history. It is impossible for anyone in Russia to forget this history. Everyone has grandparents or great grandparents who died as a result of World War II. And they understand the threat that is posed to them from a militarized Europe. They remember that. It is part of their stories, much in a way that it isn't ever a part of ours. After World War II, NATO was formed in 1949, and part of the bone of contention at the time was whether the western part of Germany was going to join NATO or not. The Russians were understandably opposed because of the history that I just shared. Needless to say, the United States, and so in 1955, West Germany joined NATO. And as a result of that fact, the Soviet Union joined with the other Eastern European countries to form the Warsaw Pact. It was a response to an unwarranted expansion of NATO. In 1990, all of the reunified Germany joined NATO instead of imagining some possible scenario. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and along with it, that was the existence of the Soviet Union was the alleged reason for the existence of NATO. But despite the fact that the Soviet Union disappeared, NATO did not evaporate along with it. NATO continued, and in fact, it expanded. Many former Soviet republics joined NATO. And here I have a map of current NATO membership. And I think it's important and relevant to compare that map with the map of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union from World War II. They look very similar. You'll notice that there are two countries up the Baltic states, Estonia and Latvia, that directly border Russia. The closest thing that we in the United States have ever come to this degree of encirclement from a hostile military alliance was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And that caused us to threaten a nuclear war. The fact that NATO expansion to the east is controversial and is a legitimate cause for disagreement is not a mystery. What I have here is a quote from former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, who served under Bill Clinton, is quoted here from some remarks that he gave in 2016, saying that most of the blame can be pointed at the actions that Putin has taken in Ukraine and other places. But in the early years, I have to say that the United States deserves much of the blame. Our first action that really set us off in a bad direction was when NATO started to expand, bringing in Eastern European nations, some of them bordering Russia. This coming from a former United States Secretary of Defense. I cannot come up with a more establishment source to describe the fact that Russians perceive, rightly, NATO expansion as a threat. This also needs to be put in context of the fact that the United States has military bases all over Western Europe. We now have some rockets in Poland as well. These places include the place where I took the SAT in 1998. And at the time, I didn't realize how extraordinary it was that another country has military bases in my country. I didn't understand that. And the question, of course, is, but isn't this a good thing? Isn't NATO expansion a good thing? And I think that the thing to help us understand that question is this fact that we often refer to the United States as the world's policeman. Well, we are now emerging out of a period of a few years in which we have come with a reckoning as a country about what it means. What is the police? What does it serve? And all too often, the United States is the kind of police that unnecessarily escalates a situation and winds up killing innocent people. I have this picture here from George Floyd's funeral. This was obviously a flashpoint that caused a big national conversation. But this is, again, where memory is important and relevant. When I gave my remarks the other night, it was about 12 years to the day before a Seattle police officer killed Indigenous woodcarver John T. Williams. George Floyd's case is extraordinary because of the amount of attention, the response that occurred as a result of it, and the fact that Officer Derek Chauvin was convicted of murder. The officer who was involved in the killing of John T. Williams was never fired, was never put on trial. He resigned from the Seattle Police Department. That is the historical norm. That is the memory that we have to keep in mind when we try to think about what the United States has been as the world's policeman. Some of you, understandably, because that is what our media has been feeding us day in and day out, might be asking, what about Putin? Well, I have nothing to say about Vladimir Putin. You can hear anywhere else. But this is where I reiterate that the Whatcom Peace and Justice Center is concerned with what our government does and with what we can have an impact on, which is our own government. And the learning that we're doing here, we're trying to do things that are not going to be displayed in the corporate media. Any of it, whether it's Fox News with its recent derangement in favor of Putin, or CNN and MSNBC. For example, the first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Ismay, who was a British man, said at the beginning of his career that NATO existed to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. That was an insightful statement. And let us reflect a little bit more on exactly what it meant to keep the Americans in. NATO's role has been promoting, quote unquote, political stability and abetting right-wing terrorism throughout Europe. That is an extraordinary statement that I'm making, and it deserves some explanation. It helps to understand it if we put it in relationship again to the idea of the police officer. The police exist to maintain a certain kind of social order. NATO is part and parcel of the same thing. I put political stability in quotes there, and I'll give you one example among many in a minute. We can begin with the fact that NATO organized secret armies throughout Western Europe. And I have the article here from the revelations that came out of Italy, where I'm from, back from November of 1990. NATO had secret armies that were not part of the public awareness or public understanding. They existed initially, allegedly, to be the forces that were going to organize the resistance in case of a Soviet invasion. But the role that they wound up playing was very different. They decided to promote a certain kind of political stability. In a book by Daniele Ganser, who wrote the book and did the research as part of his PhD thesis, he opens with this episode from May of 1972, in which 3 police officers were killed by a car bomb that they had been lured to investigate in a place called Peteano. The Italian authorities immediately directed the investigation towards left-wing terrorists, but 10 years later, a new investigation revealed that the true authors were right-wing extremists. And that same investigation also exposed a pattern of systematic sabotage of the original investigation on part of the Italian Secret Service. The mission of NATO was to keep the United States in and the Soviets out, cost what it may cost. The entire machinery of the Italian state was part and parcel of that mission. The Italian Parliament's official inquiry in 2001 around NATO's secret armies, around the Peteano incident, stated that throughout its existence, NATO's clandestine operation has included people tied to the fascist regime, both as soldiers and as officers. This has also included people connected to right-wing extremisms. And secrecy in regards to NATO's clandestine operation began a practice of hiding the truth, which became the standard operating procedure to hide the right-wing responsibility for terrorist attacks. And this pattern involved the Italian Secret Service and the Italian Interior Ministry. Political stability means a certain kind of political order. In which the Americans are in. The Soviet Union was, by this point in 1972, a remote threat of invasion. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this idea of political stability. The Red Brigades, a left-wing terrorist organization, kidnapped the Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro in 1978. And we have this testimony from the Assistant Secretary of State who was sent to Italy to participate in the high-level government conversations about what to do about this. And he says, with Aldo Moro's death, with the Italian Prime Minister's death, we prevented the Italian Communist Party from joining the coalition government, and we avoided the, quote, destabilization of Italy and Europe. In this view, in the social order that NATO exists to protect, the natural expression of the Italian people's will, as manifested through an election, through a democratic process of forming a coalition government, that was destabilization. It was unacceptable. It would have been, quote, destabilizing for the Italian people to have a government that represented the majority of their voters as a result of the recent election. That is what destabilization means. It's a technical term. Right-wing terrorist attacks and the decision to allow the Italian prime minister to be killed, those don't count as destabilization because those are there to preserve actual stability, in quotes, keeping the Americans in. And I don't know, right? I'm not here to say that are you saying that it would have been better if Italy hadn't gone with the communists? What I can say is that the people here on this plaque are the 80 people who were killed by a right-wing terrorist attack on the Bologna train station that one of my cousins, who was in Italy, barely missed. She was coming there to see my birth. She barely missed by a couple of days being blown up by that bomb. Now, I don't know if those children, you can maybe barely see there, some of the kids that only have one digit in their name, if they would have preferred to be killed by, or to live under an oppressive regime, or to be killed in a bomb attack that the Italian government then desperately tried to escape responsibility for. The window that you see there, maybe some of those of you who are watching have been through the Bologna train station. That on the picture on the right there is a location of where the bomb was. It's unassuming, maybe people don't notice it, but that's what that's there to memorialize. And now, having said this, maybe let me linger on that slide here for a second again. This is a difficult thing to chew on, that the United States has been the world's policeman in the same way that our domestic police have been the police. Often unnecessarily escalating situations and killing innocent people. If you look at the record, you will find that much in the same way that it might be difficult to accept this new understanding of policing that we have about how it works within our own country, sit with that, digest it, and understand that that is what the role that the United States has played internationally as well. And it's difficult to do that if you read the corporate media, the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News, because our corporate media only considers this a crisis when the other people do it. The same corporate media that helped lay the groundwork for the war in Iraq. I have this quote here from what is it, NPR? There's an NPR headline here. It's a crisis when Russia may try to install a pro-Kremlin leader in the Ukraine. It is not a crisis, is it in fact stability, when the Italian people are prevented from forming a coalition government that would express the will of their voters, and instead we are stuck with a government that keeps the Americans in. That is stability. And as I begin to conclude my remarks here, I want to identify the fact that whenever our politicians talk about in lofty language about values and principles, we should always remember what we seem to understand very well when it comes to other countries' leaders. We understand that other countries' leaders talk about what they're about is power, not principles. But when we hear, for example, here I have a quote from Vice President Biden back from 2014. He says, he said after Russia had annexed Crimea, no nation has the right to simply grab land from another nation. No nation has that right. And we will never recognize Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea, and neither will the world. Those are lofty words, powerful words. We want, perhaps, to believe that that is what the United States stands for in the world. But if that were a statement of principle, why do we give Israel $3 billion a year to occupy the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, southern Lebanon, and the Syrian Golan Heights? If this idea that no nation has the right to grab land from another nation, why, for 50 years, has Turkey, which is a member of NATO, been occupying the northern part of Cyprus? My sister lives where I have that arrow there, and these dashed gray lines are the lines that separate the quote-unquote free part of Cyprus from the northern part, which has been under Turkish military occupation since 1974. My sister lives 5 minutes away from landmines that separate those two parts. If President Biden meant it when he said no nation has the right to grab land from another nation, why do we have a member of NATO that for 50 years has been engaging in unlawful military occupation? And I'm going to close where I started. If this were a statement of principle, the national conversation that we have about the theft of land from the indigenous people that have lived here from time immemorial would be rather different. It is difficult to reconcile these lofty statements of principle with the maps that we know we've all seen that show the military encroachment of the United States on indigenous lands. There's one more thing worth saying here at the end. I'm going to skip through a bunch of slides that I had with references. I'm going to skip here. Again, the Whatcom Peace and Justice Center condemns the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we also oppose the expansion of NATO. And again, as United States citizens, we're going to focus our time and attention on what we can have an impact on. And maybe that seems difficult. It's easy to fall into the narrative that we are going to sweep in, shoot a bunch of people, and fix things. But if we begin to think, oh, maybe we have a responsibility here that goes deeper than that, then we begin to think, oh, well, that's hard. We have to change our own government then all of a sudden. And I want to emphasize a story about how that happens on a regular basis and how that happened in particular, even when it comes to issues of war and peace. when the organizing was happening that began the Whatcom Peace and Justice Center to oppose the US invasion of Iraq, at that moment in time, we were not successful. But that effort left traces, it left effects. And in 2013, for the first time in recorded history, a combination of domestic and international pressure stopped a United States president from launching airstrikes. And because of this domestic and international pressure, it just so happens that some chemical weapons got destroyed in the process. I have some dates in the background there that highlight the background of the situation that I'm describing. This is the long tail of the efforts against the war in Iraq. We maybe want to see results immediately, but we have to think in the long term. Maybe that is a good place to stop this reflection. We'll do another video talking about people's questions about, well, isn't this an opportunity when we might want to militarily intervene? That will produce next. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you are leaving here with something to chew on.